So I have a question that's kind of more of an opinion type question. But when you look at this from the big picture, kind of looking at everything that has happened, and looking at it from your, really digging into the research and actually seeing the numbers and all that sort of thing, do you think that was just kind of like a comedy of errors where it was one mistake after another, people overreacting to different things, or do you see some kind of like purpose in this, something nefarious?
Well, my vision, thanks for that question. My vision of that question is based on my research on geopolitics. So I
Mm-hmm.
wrote a large paper, which we haven't talked about, which was about the geopolitics of globalization since the Second World War. And
Mm-hmm.
so there were two major events that happened. One was the U.S. Unanimously opted out of the Bretton Woods Agreement in the early 70s, and that transformed the world. And that was the first big cycle of globalization controlled by Western powers centered in the United States. And then the next really huge acceleration of globalization occurred at the point where the Soviet Union disintegrated. So
Mm-hmm.
the early 90s, 1992 roughly, the early 90s was the next big turning point in this so-called globalization, which means financial and resource globalization. And that cycle, that second cycle, which was huge, and we have studied it in detail and looked at all kinds of data that shows that big turning point, and also the official documents of the United Nations and of various state legislatures and so on. So I wrote a big paper about that, and what we found was that. Um, in addition to this really aggressive globalization in terms of monopolizing the big corporations and the big financial interests and so on, and really bringing the world that could be controlled by the U.S. centered enterprise into alignment, and even being more vicious than previously regarding the allies, so Japan and Europe and so on. It was also accompanied by ideological newness. So at the same time in the early 90s, you had an environmental movement that was born out of thin air. Okay, so there were these
Mm-hmm.
global conferences, the Earth Day and so on, that started telling us that carbon was going to destroy the planet. And you
Right.
at the same time you had NGOs, which are these private uh, money funded, non-democratic entities acquired the status of a person with rights and a say at the UN. Okay, this happened at the same time. And at the same time, you had um, gender equity that became something disproportionate in the sense that it was not about that where children were being killed in wars and were being brought in as soldiers and were being used as sex slaves. It was that female children were
Mm-hmm.
being exploited in this way. And the UN became all about the female child being exploited in this way around the world. And what became important was that you had all the Senate, you had to have as many female Senate members as male Senate members and as many female government,
Mm-hmm.
and that became like the new kind of thing, and that led to a new wave of feminism that became really important and overtook a lot of academia. And at the very same time, and this each had its own international conference that happened in the early 90s, was the anti-racism movement, but a new kind of anti-racism movement. So it was no longer about you can't have discrimination, you can't exploit weaker countries, you can't exploit entire regions just because you have a military presence there. It was no longer about those kinds of really big and vile exploitations, but it became about equally about racism in the language, racism in thought and attitude, and at the
Mm-hmm.
same and the academia was geared in that same direction, led by the World Health by the UN. Okay, so racism became racism of thought. Racism. It was no longer primarily stopping the actual mega crimes against humanity and stopping the actual harms, the physical harms that were happening. So this all happened, and you can follow it. And I wrote a huge paper about this as one of the reports for the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, um, which got covered in the media, at least the alternative media, quite a lot. So that is the context that I understand this in. And in that context, what has happened recently is that it's becoming more and more clear that China, with Russia and some others, Eurasia, is developing and is understanding that it needs to dissociate itself financially. It cannot be controlled by the US centered system. And so it is standing up. And that standing up is very real and is very strong and is very regular. And there is a rise. And that is, so the world is going from being a hegemony to being at least bipolar world. Okay.
Hmm.
And that is freaking out the US system and the mega financiers that manage a lot of how the world is occupied. They are freaking out because the US dollar will no longer be the global currency, which has been the basis, the kind of the mechanistic basis of that exploitation. And so they're looking for something else. And one of the big ways to solve this problem is to enforce a carbon economy, and to have currency tied to carbon and to control that. So that has explained the drive for this whole carbon madness. Um, another and but what so they're trying to create as many ties as they can to their currency and things that they want to be real in the world. See, they can't control energy like they used to. The problem with fossil fuels is there's way more of them than you can control on the planet. Okay? So you've got Venezuela, you've got Russia, you've got Canada, you've got all these places can discover more fossil fuels. China can buy coal from and get coal and has coal. Coal and fossil fuel are extremely abundant on the planet. And so it's no longer a question of just controlling the Middle East. So the Middle East model is failing, which is why Israel is nervous, I think, also, and they should be. So you can't. They want to control it, and they do things to control the price of fossil fuel. They don't want their competitors, Russia and Venezuela, to benefit from a high price of fossil fuel, but they need a high price of fossil fuel to prop up the US dollar as the world currency. So what they need is they need as many um, tangible things or things made tangible that are tied to a currency that they control. So they want an e-currency that's tied to carbon, or
Mm.
or they want currency is also largely tied. The U.S. dollar has been tied to the opium trade, which is why you have the occupation in Afghanistan. Okay, that's a big part of propping up the dollar. The other big thing that could prop up this e-currency that they're thinking of installing as the global currency would be a dependence on the pharmaceutical industry for health and survival. So if they can convince us that everyone must have one or several vaccines every year, and it's a question of human survival, and that all governments should be paying for this, and that they should be enforcing this, and that you need to have an electronic passport to prove that you have had your vaccines, or else you cannot travel, cannot have a business, you cannot live basically in the world without this, then they have created yet another thing that they control, that they produce, that they sell, that it gives value to their new e-currency. Okay? So they, whatever global currency you want to install, it has to be tied to something that is believed to be real or that is real, such as fossil fuel, opium, the armaments themselves. If you've got a racket like the US has had, which is to uh, sell overpriced military equipment, protection to the allies, then you've got a way to ensure that they need US dollars to buy that protection in the form of overpriced military equipment that often doesn't work. So these are the rackets that sustain a global currency that in turn is the mechanism for global exploitation. So as long as they can keep China, Russia in line, and as long as they can impose themselves financially in this way, they can continue to control the world. And so I think a lot of this is in play here. And I think that vaccines and pharma, like genetically modified crops and so on, same kind of deal. All of these things are about controlling the world. That's my understanding of it. Yeah.
And so the whole COVID business was essentially just an extension of that,
Yeah, it's
just kind
just
of
one
further
of one of many
forcing.
campaigns along those lines. You've
Mhm.
got the global warming campaign, which becomes the climate campaign. You've got all these campaigns, and at the same time, you're keeping all the professional and middle class managers of the empire preoccupied with uh, anti-racist language
Mhm.
and gender equity in every workplace, and whether or not our carbon footprint is too big. So you've got everybody ideologically aligned with that, and it becomes okay to have a military campaign, intervene to protect, if someone wants to burn too much coal or not have gender equity or whatever, then it becomes okay. Everything that the empire does in the world is seen through the filter of those glasses. So it's kind of a national religion for the empire to have this wonderful anti-racist, politically correct language and to be completely obsessed with that. Um, so it all kind of fits together in that way, and it's social engineering, and all our
Mhm.
institutions participate in it, and all our institutions follow the suggestions and directives of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, because these institutions have traditionally been controlled by the high finance centers centered in the US. But with the new, now what has happened is that those finance centers are in competition with more nationalist industry in the United States. That's why you've got the Republican Democrat battles, and that's why you've got the Trump phenomenon, is because Trump's financial base, if you like, is more tied to the military and military armament industry, which is domestic, and also domestic fossil fuel production, which is really big now in the United States. Um, so the national industry interests have been tied to Trump, and that is a very real and important movement because it wants to ensure that the middle class in the United States is treated well and does well. And that becomes the political basis for a nationalist Trump-like movement. Okay, so you've got an opposition between that and the truly globalized finance centers that are more tied to the CIA and so on,
Mhm.
that want to don't care about the middle class in the United States or in any Western country, really. They only care about the professional and managerial classes that they need, and a complete control of everything. So they made the mistake of ignoring the middle class too much, the working and middle class. And so now we have this very real battle. I don't buy this thing that it's controlled opposition and that the Democrats and the Republicans presently are just two facets of the same thing. To some degree, that's true, but to a large degree, there's a very real political war going on. And it's about these very two different visions of how can a strong nation, how can the empire be strong? And Trump et al. Are saying you need a strong middle class and working class. You need the domestic culture and people and economy to be strong if you want to be a leader in the world. And the globalists have forgotten that. They've forgotten that they need a base because they can live anywhere, and they can just uh, be well by taking care only of the elite circles. Okay, as long as they control things. So that's the kind of thing that that's the way I understand it. That's the way I see it.